In 1980, 4 village nuns from Northern California mysteriously vanished without a trace, leaving their close-knit community hollow with grief and uneasy speculation. But 28 years later, the priest makes a shocking discovery, uncovering the horrifying truth about what really happened to them. The morning sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Agnes of Mercy Catholic Church, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the polished wooden pews. Father Elias Morrow stood at the altar, his voice solemn yet steady as he concluded the memorial prayer service. "May the souls of the departed through the mercy of God rest in peace." He intoned, making the sign of the cross before him. "Amen," the congregation responded in unison. Father Elias looked out at the assembled faces. Many elderly, some middle-aged, and a few younger parishioners all had gathered on this somber day to remember the 4 nuns who had vanished without a trace exactly 28 years ago. The mystery had haunted the small town of Eldon Hollow, North California, for nearly 3 decades now as the service ended. Father Elias moved to the church entrance, greeting each member of the congregation as they filed out. Many offered condolences, though after 28 years the words had taken on a ritualistic quality, rather than carrying the raw emotion of fresh grief. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Harmon," Father Elias said, clasping the elderly woman's wrinkled hands in his own. "Your presence means a great deal. I always come, Father," she replied, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I can still remember Sister Mildred teaching my children their catechism, such a gentle soul." Father Elias nodded, feeling the familiar pang of sorrow. Sister Mildred Hayes had been 68 when she disappeared, a lifetime of service to God, cut short by whatever tragedy had befallen her, and the other 3 nuns, one by one, the parishioners departed, each carrying a different memory of the missing women. Sister Mildred Hayes, 68, Sister Joan Keller, 65, Sister Beatrice Namora, 28, and the youngest Sister Tertz Marrow, 23. For Father Elias, the wound ran deepest. Sister Tertz had been his biological sister, and her disappearance had shaken his faith to its core. When the last of the congregation had left, Father Elias slowly made his way back through the now empty church. His footsteps echoed in the silence as he moved toward his private office at the rear of the building. The space was modestly furnished with a simple desk, a bookshelf filled with theological texts, and a window overlooking the church cemetery. Alone at last, Father Elias sank into his chair and buried his face in his hands. The composed facade he maintained for his parishioners crumbled away, leaving only a man consumed by grief and unanswered questions. "Why, Lord?" he whispered, his voice ragged with emotion. "I have served you faithfully all these years. My sister dedicated her life to you. Why have you not led me to them? What lesson am I failing to learn from Thistriel?" Tears leaked between his fingers as his shoulders shook with silent sobs. He rarely allowed himself this moment of weakness, but the anniversary always stripped away his carefully constructed defenses. After several minutes, Father Elias drew a deep breath and wiped his eyes. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a small wooden box. Inside lay several photographs preserved with loving care. Despite the passage of years, the first was of Therese. On the day she took her final vows, her young face beamed with joy and purpose beneath her veil, and Father Elias felt both pride and a stab of guilt as he gazed at the image. He had been the one to nurture her faith, to encourage her vocation. He could still remember their conversations when she was just 16, her eyes all light with conviction as she spoke of her calling. "I was so proud of you," he murmured to the photograph. "I still am." The thought that had haunted him for 28 years crept into his mind. If he hadn't encouraged her religious vocation, would she still be here today? Would she be a mother, a teacher, alive and well instead of? "In the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit," Father Elias said sharply, making the sign of the cross to banish the treacherous thought. He could not allow himself to question God's plan, even in his darkest moments. Setting aside Teresa's photograph, he reached for another, the last known image of the 4 missing nuns. They sat together on a wooden bench outside the small remote St. Dina Chapel, near the edge of Shasta Trinity National Forest. Sister Mildred and Sister Joan, the eldest, sat with their hands folded placidly in their laps, their lined faces serene. Sister Beatrice sat beside them, her posture more relaxed, but her expression reverent, and beside her was Therese, the youngest, her eyes bright with purpose even. In the faded photograph, the photograph had been taken by a local visitor just days before the nuns disappeared. They had traveled to Stadina's chapel for a short spiritual retreat, 2 days of fasting, prayer, and silence before the feast of a Catholic. Saint the deceased had also tasked them with assessing the old chapel's condition to determine whether it should be restored or decommissioned. Sister Tertz, with her eye for detail, had been asked to document the state of the structure. Father Elias stared at the image, his mind drifting to calculations he'd made countless times before. Sister Mildred would be 96 now, Sister Joan, 93. Even if by some miracle they had survived whatever befell them, they would be frail ancient women, but Beatrice would be 56 and Terrace just 51, still potentially in the prime of life. He remembered the frantic days and weeks after their disappearance. The police had searched the forest extensively, combing through underbrush and scaling the nearby mountainside search. Parties had spread out through surrounding farms, villages, and towns, but not a single clue had emerged. No scraps of clothing, no personal effects, no signs of struggle. It was as if the 4 women had simply vanished into thin air. The official theory had eventually settled on a bear attack. The Shasta Trinity National Forest was known for its wildlife, including black bears, that could become aggressive if threatened. Perhaps the sisters had wandered too far into the woods and encountered a predator. But the complete absence of evidence had always made this explanation feel hollow to Father Elias, and to many others as well. Over the years, uglier rumors had circulated, whispers that the nuns had abandoned their vows and run away to start new lives. Father Elias and the church had worked tirelessly to quash such speculation, but the seeds of doubt had been planted in the community nonetheless. Theirs would never have done that, he whispered, tracing his sister's face in the photograph. She would never have left without telling me. As he continued to gaze at the photograph, his eyes drifted to the chapel in the background. St. Denis had been a simple structure constructed in the 1920s to serve the scattered Catholic population in the area. Its white walls and modest bell tower were visible behind the nuns, surrounded by the looming trees of the forest edge. Something tugged at Father Elias's heart as he studied the building. He hadn't visited St. Denis in over 20 years, finding the memories too painful to bear. But now on this anniversary, he felt a strange urge to see it again, to walk where his sister had walked, to pray. Where she had prayed, perhaps it was mere sentimentality, a desire to feel close to Therese on this difficult day, or perhaps a small voice whispered in the back of his mind. There was still something to be discovered there. Some clue overlooked in the initial investigation, the latter thought. Was almost certainly foolish. What could possibly remain to be found after 28 years? Yet the pull was undeniable. Father Elias carefully replaced the photographs in the box, except for the one of the 4 nuns at St. Denis, which he slipped into his pocket. He rose from his desk, collected his Bible and rosary, and left his office with purpose in his stride in the church parking lot. He slid behind the wheel of his modest sedan, placed the photograph on the passenger seat beside him, and said a brief prayer. For guidance then, he turned the key in the ignition and pulled away from St. Agnes, heading toward the forest and the ghosts off his past. The winding road leading from Eldon Hollow to the Shasta Trinity National Forest carried Father Elias through. Changing landscapes, the town's neat houses and businesses gave way to scattered farms, which eventually surrendered to the encroaching wilderness. Tall pines and cedars crowded the roadside, their shadows dappling the asphalt as he drove. The journey took approximately an hour and a half, giving Father Elias ample time to reflect. He found himself recalling the numerous times he had made the same drive in the weeks following the nun's disappearance. Back then his car had been filled with missing person flyers bearing Teresa's face, and his heart had been buoyed by desperate hope. Now he carried only memories and a resigned acceptance of the mystery that had shaped his life as the road narrowed and began to climb into the foothills. Father Elias slowed. His vehicle, St. Denis Chapel, had been situated on a small clearing near the forest edge, accessible via a modest dirt road that branched off from the main highway. He scanned the roadside looking for the familiar turnoff when he reached what he believed to be the correct location. Father Elias frowned in confusion. Instead of the simple dirt path he remembered, he found a paved private road blocked by an ornate gate. A no trespassing sign was displayed alongside smaller notices warning of private property. "This can't be right," he muttered. Pulling his car to the side of the road, he consulted the photograph he had brought, comparing the background landscape to what he could see from his position. The mountains in the distance matched, as did the particular arrangement of taller trees on the ridgeline. This was indeed the correct location, but where was St. Denis Chapel? Father Elias exited his vehicle and approached the gate on foot beyond it. He could see the private road stretching into the forest, but there was no sign of the white chapel building. Instead, the area appeared to have been extensively landscaped with ornamental trees and shrubs lining the driveway. Bewildered, he reached for his cell phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number. For Harold Gibbons, the longtime caretaker of St. Denis. They hadn't spoken in years, but Father Elias hoped the man might still be in the area and able to provide some explanation. The phone rang several times before a gruff voice answered, "Hello, Harold. This is Father Elias Morrow from St. Agnes in Eldon Hollow." There was a pause, then recognition. "Father Elias, it's been quite some time. How are you?" "I'm well, thank you," Father Elias replied, though it wasn't entirely true. "Harold, I'm standing at what I believe to be the entrance to St. Das, but the chapel appears to be gone." Another pause, longer this time. "That's right, Father. The Das CC decommissioned the chapel years ago. It was sold in 1982 to a man named Silas Redwood. He demolished it, Father." Elias felt a chill despite the warmth of the day. "I never heard anything about the chapel being sold, let alone demolished well after what happened with the nuns' attendance dropped off significantly. Then there was that incident with the bell tower cracking and nearly injuring poor Thomas Frell. The bishop decided it wasn't worth the upkeep for such a small congregation, Father." Elias found himself staring at the no trespassing sign with growing unease. "This Silas Redwood, does he still own the property?" "Oh, yes," Harold confirmed. "He's got quite a spread back there. His main house is a ways in near where the forest gets thicker. The chapel site is just part of his estate." "Now I see," Father Elias said slowly. "I had hoped to visit the chapel today for personal reasons. It's the anniversary." Harold's voice softened with understanding. "Of course, it's been 28 years today, hasn't it?" "I'm sorry, you came all this way for nothing, Father. If Mr. Redwood is generally receptive to visitors, perhaps." "If I explain the situation, to be honest, he's not known for his hospitality," Harold replied, cautiously. "Bit of a recluse from what I hear, keeps to himself, doesn't mix much with the locals." Father Elias sighed, disappointment settling heavily on his shoulders. "Well, thank you for the information, Harold. I appreciate it." "Listen, Father," Harold said, his tone brightening slightly. "I still live nearby, not 15 minutes from where you are now. I saved some items from the chapel when it was decommissioned, the old altar cross, some prayer books, things like that. You're welcome to come see them if you'd like." "That's very kind of you," Father Elias replied. "Perhaps I will, but first I think I'd like to try speaking with Mr. Redwood. Do you know how I might reach his main house?" Harold hesitated. "Well, there's the private road you're looking at, but that gate's always locked. There's a public road that loops around, though. It'll take you near enough to the property after receiving directions from Harold." Father Elias thanked him and ended the call. He returned to his car, conflicted about his next move. Part of him felt he should respect Silas Redwood's privacy and head straight to Harold's home instead, but a stronger impulse propelled him toward the public road that would lead to Redwood's estate. 20 minutes later, Father Elias found himself driving along a narrow lane that skirted the edge of what must have been Redwood's property. Through gaps in the trees, he caught glimpses of manicured grounds and eventually a substantial structure that resembled a mountain lodge more than a conventional house. The building was impressive, 3 stories of natural stone and timber with expansive windows and multiple terraces overlooking the forest. It spoke of wealth that seemed at odds with the modest rural surroundings. Father Elias located a small parking area near what appeared to be a service entrance to the property. He parked his car, straightened his clerical collar, and approached the imposing residence with a mixture of determination and apprehension. As he neared the front entrance, a stone pathway led him past carefully tended gardens and a small decorative pond. The craftsmanship of the place was undeniable. Yet Father Elias couldn't help but feel a sense of disked the steps to the front door and knocked firmly on the heavy oak panel. The door swung open almost immediately, revealing a tall, athletic man in his 60s, dressed in expensive exercise attire. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and in one hand he held a leather dog leash. The man's expression shifted from neutral expectation to unmistakable displeasure as he registered Father Elias's clerical attire. "Yes," he asked, not bothering to disguise the impatience in his tone. "Good afternoon," Father Elias said with a warm smile. "Are you Mr. Silas Redwood?" Theman's jaw tightened. "I am, and you are trespassing on private property. I apologize for arriving unannounced. My name is Father Elias Marrow from St. Agnes of Mercy Church in Eldon Hollow." He extended his hand, but Silas Redwood made no move to take it. "What do you want?" Redwood demanded, his finger straightening around the dog leash. Father Elias lowered his hand, maintaining his calm demeanor. "Despite the hostility, I was hoping I might have a few minutes of your time, you see. I visited the site where St. Den's Chapel used to stand, and I was surprised to find it gone. If you already saw it's not there, why come bothering me?" Redwood's voice had taken on an edge that was almost a snarl. "I spoke with Harold Gibbons, the former caretaker. He mentioned you had purchased the property. I simply wanted to what blame me for buying land that was for sale?" Redwood stepped forward aggressively, causing Father Elias to take an involuntary step back. "Are you one of those who thinks that ground is somehow sacred? The deceased didn't think so when they sold it?" No, Father Elias said quickly, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "I don't blame you at all. I was just curious about the circumstances. The chapel held personal significance for me, and I wasn't aware it had been demolished." Redwood seemed momentarily mollified, though his expression remained cold. "Well, now you know it's gone, and good riddance. I sleep better now that I don't have to hear that blasted bell ringing 3 times a day and giving me migraines." Father Elias couldn't help but respond to this. "The Angelus bell is a beautiful tradition, Mr. Redwood. It calls the faithful to recite the Lord's Prayer and honors the incarnation of God. It's meant to be a reminder of holy things, of our freedom from sin and death." "Oh, spare me the sermon," Redwood scoffed. "People can set alarms on their phones. If they need reminding to pray, they don't need to disturb the entire countryside with medieval noise pollution." The conversation was clearly not progressing in a positive direction. Father Elias decided to try a different approach. "I understand you value your privacy, Mr. Redwood, and I've intruded on your time. I apologize for that. Perhaps we could speak another day when it's more convenient for you." "There won't be another day," Redwood said flatly. "I have no interest in discussing a building that hasn't existed for decades with a priest I've never met. Before now, I suggest you leave before I call the sheriff and report you for trespassing." Father Elias nodded, recognizing the futility of continuing. "Very well, thank you for your time, Mr. Redwood. Peace be with you." Redwood's only response was to close the door firmly in his face with a heavy sigh. Father Elias turned and made his way back down the stone path toward his car. The encounter had left him feeling both disappointed and unsettled. There had been something in Redwood's manner beyond mere rudeness that suggested a deeper antipathy toward the church and its representatives. As he reached his vehicle, Father Elias glanced back at the imposing house. Was it merely his imagination, or was Redwood watching him from one of the upper windows? The sensation of being observed prickled at the back of his neck. He slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, torn between returning to Eldon Hollow and stopping at Harold Gibbons's home as the man had invited him to do. Perhaps seeing some of the preserved items from his DNAs would provide the closure he had sought by coming here today. As he drove away from Redwood's estate, Father Elias found himself taking the road that would pass near the former site of the chapel. He couldn't explain the compulsion after all. He now knew there was nothing to see, but something drew him back in that direction. The car rounded a bend, bringing him within view of the approximate location. Where St. Dinas Hadant stood through a gap in the trees, he could make out a cleared area where the small building had been now landscaped with ornamental shrubs. Suddenly the car's radio crackled to life, emitting a strange, haunting sound. Father Elias started, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. The sound was unmistakable. Gregorian chant, the ancient ethereal music of monastic worship. But the radio was off. Had distinctly remembered turning it off when he left Eldon Hollow. Father Elias pulled the car to the side of the road and stared at the radio in bewilderment. The chanting continued for several seconds, then faded away as abruptly as it had begun. "What on earth?" he murmured, reaching out to touch the radio dial. He turned it on and then off again, but the mysterious chanting did not return. Had he imagined it a trick of an exhausted mind, perhaps, or some strange electrical malfunction in his aging vehicle? Yet Ash sat there, a peculiar sensation washed over him. The same feeling he had experienced earlier while looking at the photograph in his office. A tugging at his heart, an inexplicable certainty that he was meant to be here now for a purpose he did not yet understand. The hair on his arms stood on end and a warmth spread through his ears. Physical sensations he had experienced before, in moments of intense prayer or spiritual insight. In seminary, his spiritual director had taught him to recognize these as potential movements of the Holy Spirit once more. The faint chanting emanated from the silent radio, and this time Father Elias was certain he wasn't imagining it. It was as if another worldly voice was calling to him, guiding him without fully understanding his own actions. Father Elias executed a careful U-turn and drove back toward the gate that blocked access to the former chapel site. Whatever was happening, he felt compelled to investigate further, even if it meant risking another confrontation with the unwelcoming Silas Redwood. Father Elias parked his car on the side of the road near the gate that marked the entrance to Silas Redwood's property. The no trespassing signs loomed before him, their warnings clear and unambiguous. He sat for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel, questioning the wisdom of what he was, contemplating. "Lord, guide my actions," he whispered. "If I am about to err in judgment, show me the right path." But the strange sensation of spiritual prompting persisted, and after a final moment of hesitation, Father Elias exited. His vehicle, he approached the gate cautiously, fully aware that he was considering trespassing on private property, an action difficult to reconcile with his moral obligations as a priest. Yet the mysterious chanting from his radio had awakened something in him, a conviction that transcended ordinary concerns rather than attempting to breach the gate itself. Father Elias began to walk along the perimeter fence, seeking a vantage point from which to view the former chapel site. The fence was substantial, 8 ft of ornate, but sturdy metal. But it followed, the contours of the uneven forest terrain occasionally dipping closer to the ground where the land rose beneath it as he walked. Father Elias closed his eyes briefly, trying to visualize the layout of St. Denis's as it had once been, if his memory served him correctly. The wooden bench where the nuns had been photographed had stood to the east of the chapel near a large oak tree. Opening his eyes, he scanned the property beyond the fence, attempting to locate landmarks that might have survived the demolition. The oak tree was gone, presumably removed during Redwood's renovations, but a cluster of pines that had stood behind the chapel remained, providing a reference point. Father Elias continued along the fence line, moving toward the area where he believed the chapel had stood. As he walked, his foot suddenly caught on an exposed tree root. Sending him stumbling forward, he reached out to catch himself, his hands grasping the metal fence, but the momentum of his fall caused his weight to press against a section where the fence posts were set in uneven ground. There was a sharp cracking sound as the weakened joint of the fence gave way, creating a gap large enough for a person to squeeze through. Father Elias found himself sprawled partially onto Redwood's property, the broken section of fence beneath him. "Oh, dear Lord," he muttered, picking himself up and brushing soil from his clothes. He had not intended to damage the fence, let alone create a means of entry onto the private land. Yet here he was, faced with an unexpected opportunity or temptation. Father Elias glanced back toward the road, ensuring no one had witnessed his accidental vandalism. The area was deserted, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the afternoon breeze. He looked down at the broken fence, then at the clearing beyond, where St. DNA had once stood. "Forgive me," he whispered, crossing himself, before carefully stepping through the gap in the fence once on Redwood's property. Father Elias moved swiftly but cautiously toward the former chapel site. The area had been landscaped with non-native ornamental plants. That seemed out of place against the backdrop of the natural forest. Nothing remained to indicate that a place of worship had ever existed here. No foundation stones, no cross, no memorial of any kind. The absence struck Father Elias as particularly sad. It was as if Silas Redwood had deliberately erased all traces of the chapel's existence, removing not just the building, but its very memory from the land. As he stood contemplating this, a flash of reflected light caught his eye, something near the ground, partially hidden by decorative shrubbery. Curious Father Elias moved closer and parted the branches to reveal a metal grate set into the earth. An air vent of some kind, it appeared old and weathered, its iron bars rusted with age. Father Elias frowned, perplexed if the chapel had been completely demolished. Why would an old air vent remain? And why would a landscaped area with no structures need ventilation at all? He crouched beside the vent, examining it more closely. The design was vintage, possibly dating back to the 1930s or 40s, with ornate scrollwork around its edges. It seemed incongruous with the modern minimalist aesthetic of Redwood's property. As he leaned closer, a sound drifted up through the grate so faint that at first Father Elias thought he had imagined it, but then it came again, a soft, melodic humming, followed by what sounded distinctly like a human cough. Father Elias's blood ran cold. The humming was reminiscent of the Gregorian chant he had heard on his car radio. But this was no electrical glitch or figment of his imagination. Someone was below ground beneath what had once been St. Da's Chapel. "Hello?" he called softly through the grate, but the humming continued, uninterrupted, suggesting the person couldn't hear him from their subterranean location. Father Elias straightened up, his mind racing. The implications were disturbing. Why would there be an underground space beneath the former chapel site? And more importantly, who was down there? He looked around, half expecting to see Silas Redwood approaching with fury in his eyes. But the property remained quiet and apparently unmonitored, at least. In this section, the main house was hidden from view by a stand of trees, and no security cameras were visible in the immediate vicinity. Drawing his cell phone from his pocket, Father Elias dialed 911, his hand trembling slightly as he raised the device to his ear. "Van, what's your emergency?" a dispatcher's voice answered. "My name is Father Elias Morrow," he said, keeping his voice low despite the apparent solitude. "I'm at the property of Silas Redwood near the former site of St. Da's Chapel off Route 37. He hesitated, suddenly aware of how strange his report would sound. "I believe someone may be trapped underground. I can hear singing and coughing coming from an air vent." There was a brief silence on the other end. "Sir, are you saying you suspect someone is being held against their will?" "I don't know," Father Elias admitted, "but there appears to be an underground space of some kind, and someone is definitely down there given the remote location and the fact that this property is private. I'm concerned."